Shutter speed, understanding how to technically and creatively adjust your shutter speed. So shutter speed is one of those three elements of the exposure triangle, with the others being aperture and ISO. The longer the shutter speed, the more light that's going to reach the sensor. Shorter or faster shutter speeds are displayed in fractions, i.e. 1/30th or 1/500th. For longer or slower shutter speeds, that's going to be displayed often in seconds. Now there are many ways to get a blurry photo, unintentionally blurry, but one of the most common is shooting at too slow a shutter speed and introducing blur by actually shaking the camera as you take a photo. There's an easy guideline to determine the minimum shutter speed that should be used without image stabilization to avoid that handshake blur, and it's simply 1 over your focal length, but don't forget to multiply for the crop factor. So if you're shooting with a 50mm focal length lens, or at the 50mm focal length, on a Canon Rebel, apply that 1.6x crop factor and your minimum shutter speed should be about 1/80th of a second. Now there's going to be a link to a chart right down below this video with crop factors of other sensor sizes that give you some ideas. But proper hand holding techniques, bracing your elbows on your body, steady breathing, or even holding your breath as you gently depress the shutter, along with practice, may allow for slower shutter speeds to be used. You need to experiment when you've got time to find out what your personal shutter speed rule should be, but keep in mind wind, cold weather, excess caffeine intake, all may dictate that a faster shutter speed be required. When it's crucial, always raise your ISO a little bit and increase that speed. A noisy image is better than a blurry image due to handshake. Some lenses and camera bodies come with a feature called image stabilization. Different manufacturers use different names, IS, VR, OIS. It all basically works the same. There's gyroscopes counteracting your hand movement to allow for handheld shots to be taken at slower shutter speeds than that hand-holding formula or guideline would suggest. Stabilization is often rated in stops. A 3-stop IS means you can shoot at shutter speeds 3 stops below the focal length guideline, or whatever you've found to be your minimum for sharp handheld shots. Now keep in mind your subject determines what shutter speed you must use. These guidelines up to now have all been for the slowest you can set the shutter speed and get a sharp shot of a static item. Moving subjects are an entirely different story. My general rule of thumb when photographing people involved in normal everyday activities, no slower than 125th of a second. For fast-moving subjects, in order to freeze motion, you're going to need to raise your shutter speed to meet the demands or speed of your subject. Dancing, sports, wildlife all often involve fast movements and may require shutter speeds of thousandths of a second to completely freeze your subject. But keep in mind you might not always want your subject to be completely frozen. Often, in order to convey motion, you want to use a slightly slower shutter speed. Again, depending on the speed of your subject, you may need a tripod or a lens with good image stabilization for this all to work out. And some lenses do offer an active mode of image stabilization that allows for panning, so it'll only correct vertical shake. Best results are usually achieved with the camera set to continuous shooting, and using proper handhold technique, you can fire off a burst of photos to increase your chances of getting a sharp image. This is also a good technique anytime you're near that minimum shutter speed, even when capturing a static subject. Shoot a burst increases your chances of getting a sharp shot, or a shot that you didn't ruin by shaking the camera. Another fun technique is panning, using a slow shutter speed to photograph a fast-moving object, following the motion of the subject with the camera and body for a higher chance of that subject being sharp. Shutter speed is going to be dependent on the speed of the subject. Typically, I find that your shutter speed should be 1 over the speed of your subject in miles per hour. So if you're photographing a car at 60 miles per hour, your shutter speed should be about 1/60th of a second. Focal length does play some role here too, with longer focal lengths often making this a little bit easier to give that sense of motion and blurring the background. This technique does come with a high failure rate often, at least for me personally, and practice in shooting a burst of images as the subject passes. I try to pick a point on my subject and track that point as smoothly as possible. Let's talk about shooting at some very long exposures, which can create beautiful moments we wouldn't otherwise see. Flowing water, light trails, light painting, astrophotography, or daytime long exposure with an ND filter to remove crowds of people from a scene. In most of these cases, you're going to need a steady tripod. Put the center column down for maximum stabilization. Turn off any image stabilization your lens or camera provides, as it often feeds back and can blur these photos at these shutter speeds. Use a cable release, timer, or Wi-Fi trigger to trigger the camera. And if you're shooting between 2 seconds to about 1/4 of a second, you should use mirror lockup. That avoids additional vibrations that come from that mirror flipping up, or shoot in live view, which is basically the same as mirror lockup. Now, most cameras don't allow shutter speeds longer than 30 seconds without using bulb mode. Bulb mode requires a remote release and will allow you to shoot for as long as you want, or your battery lasts. Although I generally don't recommend longer than 10 to 20 minutes at a time to avoid heat buildup and additional noise on your sensor. Now, I commonly hear from people new to long exposures that their images are just white. This simply means there's too much light and you need to figure out a way to cut the light. You can close your aperture down as much as possible, lower your ISO to its lowest setting. If you're still getting white photos, you need to add a filter or wait until the light level drops, i.e. the sun goes down. I would love to see your favorite long exposure or panning shots. There's a link below this video to a thread on Facebook where I'll be responding to your posts. Take a moment and share an image there. Did you find this basics video helpful? Take a moment to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more great photography tips, gear reviews, and travel videos. Thanks for watching.
Preview.